The Colombian presidential elections are currently taking place. The three main candidates leading in the polls, and whatever the outcome, there will be a new leader. Gustavo Petro, the first ever left-wing president in Colombia, can only run for one term in office because of a bill passed in Congress in 2015 eliminating presidential re-election. The biggest issue for voters, according to recent polling, remains security, first and foremost, above basic access to food, even housing, services, second, unemployment is third. So who are the three main contenders? Well, one offers a continuity option for the left, Iván Cepeda. Then there's Paz Total. He was one of the architects of this total peace policy, and it completely changed the historic shift for Colombia under Gustavo Petro. Total peace, which offers to prioritise negotiating with armed groups over all-out military action. We've also got Abelardo de la Espriella, who is a social media savvy hard-right populist, self-styled as El Tigre, the tiger, and he's promising to end all negotiations with armed groups. Talks of mano duro, iron fist, and building mega prisons like President Bukele in El Salvador. And then there's Paloma Valencia, close to the centre-right. She's promising to dismantle this total peace agenda, is fighting for the same right-wing base, but without the machismo, without the performative gimmicks of her rival, she claims. She's accused of representing the establishment. Let's talk to Kinley Salmon, the Economist Latin America correspondent based in Montevideo, who's met the candidates in recent days and joins us on the programme. Welcome to France 24, Kinley. Thank you for talking to me tonight.
Thanks for having me on.
Let's talk about your encounters, first of all, Kinley, the potential presidents, your sense of them as personalities and their visions as well.
Well, they're very sort of starkly different figures is the thing that really stands out. I mean, Abelardo de Espriella is a real performer. You know, he has these rallies, they're quite choreographed. He kind of pumps up the crowds. There's, a huge sense of excitement around him. When I met him in person, he was a little more soft-spoken, but clearly a kind of man who's got charisma, but also a kind of a penchant for kind of big claims and big statements. And he makes a lot of big promises in his campaign. Kind of the big contrast is with Iván Cepeda. He's the left-wing candidate, a very left-wing vision, but personally as well. He's a sort of calm, more austere figure. He believes very strongly in dialogue, and almost, it seems, almost any circumstance. And so he comes across extremely differently. He tends to dress in, Nehru collar shirts and cardigans versus kind of Italian suits for Abelardo. And then somewhere in the middle is Paloma Valencia, who, if she were to win and become president, would be the first female president for the country. And she is, more of an establishment figure. I think it's fair to say she's the granddaughter of a former president of Colombia and closely associated also with a more recent former president, Álvaro Uribe. But she brings a more technical perspective. She has a sort of, she comes across as, she talks in depth about policy in a way that the others don't do as often, I would say.
And this total peace policy, Kinley, is divisive, and Gustavo Petro is likely to be remembered, isn't he, for that signature policy, whether that's as a visionary or as a cautionary tale, depends on what comes next. Can you explain total peace and its effect or success, if that's the right word?
Yeah, certainly. Well, total peace, we should say this builds on a peace agreement in 2016 with the FARC rebels done under a previous president. But total peace sort of seeks to expand that because there are other groups that didn't sign that 2016 agreement who are still, operating. I think we should be clear that these days, most of these groups are, in essence, drug trafficking groups. Their sort of ideology, although it may, remain in some of their names, is pretty secondary to the drug trafficking business. But what President Petro has tried to do is simultaneously negotiate with all of these groups to try to get to a kind of grand accord, if you like, on the logic that you need an agreement with all of them, or else, someone that hasn't signed might take advantage of, the territory that has been given up in a peace accord. So do it all at once. But I think, unfortunately, that the truth is this just hasn't worked well. I mean, we saw the Red Cross came out and said that civilians are now more impacted by the violence than they have been for a decade. Cocaine is a lot behind all this, but production of that's at pretty much record highs. So the record of total peace in the 4 years Petro has been pursuing it is frankly poor. And Iván Cepeda is in many ways an architect of that policy and promises to continue doing it. He says he'll do it a little bit differently, maybe more organized, but fundamentally he wants to carry on with something that the right wing says, look, this just hasn't been working. It hasn't been bringing about peace.
And if you look at some of the figures, I think I'm right in saying one of the biggest groups, the Gulf Clan. I think these figures of membership was about 7,000, wasn't it, a couple of years ago? It's now said to be between 23 and 27,000. So it's in this ceasefire or truce, if you will, that they've gathered momentum, and therefore the security is more of an issue. And this is where the two candidates on the right are promising then to reverse it, Kinley, and also pledging, is this right, to join Trump's America's counter-cartel initiative. This is the heart of it being lethal force to destroy, quote, sinister cartels.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, the two right-wing candidates, Abelardo de Espriella and Paloma, are both promising, a much tougher line on all these issues of security. They want, a close alliance with the Trump administration. They want military cooperation and to an even greater degree than has happened in the past. But they also want to, recruit more soldiers. They want to build, Abelardo talks about building 10 mega prisons in the jungle. And when I met him, he told me, in the style of President Bukele, in El Salvador, who has these famously tough mega prisons. So it's a real iron fist narrative, in particular from Abelardo. But Paloma is also promising, a very tough line on these groups, and that is just, really in total opposition to what Ivan Cepeda is promising from the left.
And I noticed something that you've said. There are similarities, and I've read your article in The Economist, an excellent piece, and it also points out, I don't know if he said it himself, but the beards are very similar, aren't they, between the two men as well? And I guess if we're talking about the two right candidates, the message is similar, is it? The tone is very different.
I think that's right. The message on security is, I would say, very similar. Abelardo is sort of channeling this Bukele style, this El Salvadorian president, who is, we should say, very popular across Latin America, because that iron fist, about which I think, you can raise a lot of questions about the rights and the due process in El Salvador, but it has brought down the murder rate. And that's popular in many countries in Latin America, including Colombia. And so Abelardo in Colombia is explicitly trying to, identify with and channel Bukele style, whereas Paloma Valencia is promising a tough line, but in perhaps less flamboyant and less explicitly, less explicitly aping Abelardo. I think we should say, though, that less explicitly aping Bukele in El Salvador. We should say, though, that Paloma does have a different set of policies, I think, in some areas. She spoke to me about the importance of helping people in the informal economy, about improving public education. Both her and Abelardo promise of freer markets for Colombia, but she's got I think, a more technical focus, and one that maybe looks at some other areas that he just doesn't emphasize, like education and like the informal economy.
And Ecuador is accused of getting involved. What's going on there?
Well, that's right. I think this is something that's quite common in Latin America these days, is that, politicians and presidents from other countries have very little shame or concern about, getting involved quite directly in the domestic politics of other countries. In this case, the president of Ecuador, Daniel Noboa, has said, if there's a right-wing candidate elected, I think he had a conversation with Abelardo recently, some of the tariffs that Ecuador and Colombia have been putting on each other in response to, disagreements about security across the border, those will be removed, he says, or reduced if the right-wing wins. So a kind of very explicit attempt to say, if the right wins, kind of a better situation for Colombia. That's, I think, surprising in historical context, but actually now something we see quite a bit across the region, that it's just considered almost normal now for a president or a politician from another country to just directly get themselves involved in an election right on the eve of it.
Briefly, in the time we have, it's also worth saying one thing that doesn't happen usually in Colombia, I think it's quite rare. I think only one president has won in the first round, President Uribe in the early 2000s. So we're likely to see a runoff. I've heard the left-wing camp say they're going to keep their powder dry until the second round. What's your sense of what to expect in terms of tactics coming up?
Well, that's right. I think a runoff is very likely. They're voting right now. Ivan Cepeda's campaign has often said, we're running a campaign to win in the first round. But I think no one really believes that. You'd have to get over 50%. He's been polling at best in the mid-40s. So I think, we're going to see a runoff. The favorite to make it through, along with Ivan Cepeda from the left, is Abelardo de Espriella, this more hard right figure. And he's had a lot of momentum in the polls. Abelardo in recent weeks. So I think, that's probably the most likely scenario. And I think then a very, very intense period of campaigning. One thing that's been notable in this early stage of the campaign, if you like, is that a lot of the back and forth has been between Paloma Valencia's campaign and Ivan Cepeda's, and neither of them have wanted to take that many shots at the Abelardo campaign. Partly because Paloma wants to show a unified right, and Cepeda, who prefers to take on the sort of traditional right against which he has a long history of fighting in the Senate and in other parts of Colombian political life. So I think we're going to suddenly see a lot more focus on Abelardo and trying to sort of bring out critiques and scandals in his past. So I think it's going to be a very, very intense campaign, probably also a slightly nastier one, even than what we've seen so far.
Thank you so much for talking to me, Kinley. Great to hear the background and insights. Thank you.